A common charge made against the Soviet system is its supposed lack of economic efficiency. That the Soviet economy was a failure is held to be a self-evident fact, following from the observation that it does not exist anymore. Unfortunately, many who characterize the Soviet economy as an abject failure know little about its inner workings, its paradigms, and its history. The most caricatured, but sadly prevalent critique boils down to the Soviet economy was bad because it failed, and it failed because it was bad. Soviet economic history is generally split into two stages: repression in the early half and stagnation in the later half. Among critics, little is said about the wide-ranging debates that were had in the early years of the USSR regarding development. In reality, countless economists, mathematicians, statisticians, and social scientists were engaged with the question of how to bring the country out of the feudal era and into modernity. Today, we will look at just one contribution to Soviet development discourse, the Feldman model. It is by no means the representation of Soviet economic doctrine. However, it does capture the general logic that motivated industrialization policy in the early five-year plans. An excellent study of the Feldman model and Soviet economic history in general is done by Robert C. Allen in his book Farm to Factory. Allen contextualizes Soviet economic achievements by comparing the emerging socialist state with its contemporary counterparts. He then elaborates on the theory and methods behind Soviet development policy. Lastly, using a modified Feldman model calibrated through simulations, he finds that the Soviet economic approach was successful in delivering improved living standards and sustained growth. Grigory Alexandrovich Feldman was a Soviet economist who worked on early planning strategies. His model for capital accumulation was predicated on the Soviet Union's unique position at its conception. The Soviets inherited a very underdeveloped economy from Tsarist Russia, meaning they had little industry to begin the modernization process with. Moreover, the country could not heavily rely on trade with industrialized nations, as most of them had closed themselves off to the USSR for ideological reasons. Lastly, with the beginning of the Great Depression, export-oriented growth was limited because of the collapse in various commodity prices. In short, the Soviets had to, almost literally, spin gold out of straw. How could the country develop so internally, given such limited avenues for progress? This was Feldman's concern when he developed his mathematical model. Following Marx's two-department economy, Feldman noted that there was a heavy producer and light consumer sector. These corresponded with Marx's Department 1, means of production, and Department 2, means of consumption. The most basic model abstracted away everything but capital, including labor and trade. We will forego a complete derivation of the model, though it isn't very complicated. There are two equations that the model yields which matter to us. One that captures growth in the producer goods sector, and one that captures growth in the consumer goods sector. Notably, growth in the heavy industry sector depends primarily on prior amounts of capital in that sector. What makes this growth slower or faster is E, which reflects the proportion of investments that go into heavy industry. The higher E is, the more fast-paced the growth in producer goods. 1 minus E is then the proportion of investments that go into the consumer goods sector. Naturally, the lower E is, the larger the proportion of investments going into the consumer goods. The equation for growth in the consumer goods sector is not only a function of past capital in that sector, but also of past capital in the producer goods sector. Thus, the second term in the equation implies that growth in the producer goods sector can spill over into the consumer goods sector. In other words, you can industrialize and raise the standard of living at the same time. We can actually show that this kind of consumer goods sector growth is possible by simply plugging in values for the equation. The graph here simulates the trajectory of growth in the light industry sector for different values of E. Notice that low investment in heavy industry, in other words high investment in light industry, initially results in a little more growth, but the gains over time are quite limited. By contrast, the more that is invested in heavy industry, the greater the growth in the consumer goods sector over time, though there is an initial dip in the consumer goods sector. The basic results of this model summarize the development strategy of the early five-year plans. Critics of the model have pointed out its lack of consideration for imports and exports, as well as the implicit assumption of resource abundance. These are very valid concerns that ring especially true for smaller countries in more modern times. The world is substantially more globalized, and as such, small developing countries absolutely must orient their economic strategies around the importance of exports and imports. However, an evaluation of the soundness of this approach for Soviet conditions shows that the model assumptions are quite reasonable. The Soviet Union did have exceptional access to resources through its large domestic endowments, and it was a significantly more closed economy than any modern state would be today. In his presentation of the Feldman model, Allen employs a production possibility frontier chart. In the simplest terms, a PPF describes how much an economy with two goods can produce. For our chart, P represents how much producer goods the theoretical Soviet economy could produce if it produced no consumer goods at all. C, by contrast, represents how much consumer goods the economy could make if it made no producer goods. The bottom curve shows all the possible combinations of producer and consumer goods the Soviet economy can make. Importantly, the area below the bottom curve is less efficient than anything on the actual curve. That is because any point in that area represents a combination of goods that is less than the maximum amount the economy could make. In our chart, at point X, the Soviet economy could still produce more producer or consumer goods. Allen uses this point to illustrate that a lot of resources, including labor, were being underutilized in the underdeveloped economy of the early USSR. By freeing up idle labor in the agricultural sector, for example, the Soviets could boost their production up to point Y on the PPF curve. This would represent an economic improvement. The second curve, PPF prime, shows a new range of possible production outcomes. This curve is possible after investment, which grows the capital stock. Importantly, the curve has a bigger shift in producer goods because that is precisely the Soviet strategy, according to the Feldman model. Remember that the results of the model tell us that investment in the producer goods sector actually increases production in both sectors of the economy. Thus, the new PPF curve is higher overall. More goods can be produced. Allen goes on to find that the Feldman model and the strategy it engendered was quite effective for the objectives the Soviets had set out to achieve. The country had built up an enormous heavy industry, and it did considerably increase the standard of living. Allen also addresses the possible causes for the eventual decline of the Soviet economic system, of which there are many. These issues are beyond the scope of this video. Indeed, the Soviet economy in its twilight years was an entirely different beast from its early industrialization days. The purpose of this video was narrow, to briefly demonstrate an economic model which captured the general Soviet strategy for development. That this model is not universally sound across space and time should be obvious. The important point is that it followed logically from the circumstances of the early Soviet period, and by many measures, it promoted successful economic outcomes. The secondary purpose of this video is to pull back the curtain on the economics of planning, to show that planning was not a clunky and willfully blind arrangement, but rather the result of decades of research in various sciences. In their pursuit of optimizing the centralized economy, Soviet planners made major contributions to a number of disciplines, pioneering such fields as linear programming, cybernetics, probability theory, complex analysis, and of course, various areas of political economy. Much of this history remains forgotten or overlooked, especially among the public in the West. It has been replaced with hollow tautologies that pass as uncontestable truths about the invariable inadequacy of Soviet economics. Even among those who reject the standard narrative, objections are mainly made on empirically stylistic grounds, which is to say by pointing to key indicators of success over time. While that is not inherently problematic, it does miss out on rich theoretical content that demonstrates the complexity of Soviet planning, complete with its strengths and its weaknesses. Ideally, our quick discussion today helps roughly sketch out the existence of this body of work.